Recording in progress.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to talk very little, except to thank you for coming, everybody here and everybody in Zoom. Franz has a lot of admirers, and I'm really excited myself to hear his story. I've got a brief introduction, and then I'm going to let Franz do his thing while I work the slides. So Franz Wasserman was born in Munich in 1920 and came to the US in 1938. He went through college and medical school at the University of Chicago, joined active service in the military as a physician in 1944. And these are the 25 years he will be reflecting upon today. Without further ado, living history, Franz Wasserman.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Move it up a little further.
Further up to me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can he take off his mask, Ellen?
No, we have to be fully masked, unfortunately. And I appreciate everyone masking and social distancing. I know it's difficult.
All right, so is this good enough now?
Yes.
Can you all hear?
Yes.
All right, so this is about the 25 years, first 25 years of my life. And it comes in three sections: my childhood and youth, and then becoming an American, and finally my time in the military toward the end of World War II. So, starting with my family history, my mother was born and raised in Stuttgart, and we don't have very much background for the previous generations for her, but the family name was Schmidt-Gall, meaning the smith from St. Gallen. And there is a St. Gallen in the area of Salzburg. And around 1800, the Protestants were expelled from Salzburg and wandered westward. So it's attractive to assume that my family on that side came from Salzburg to Munich to Stuttgart. And there is an epic written by Goethe called Hermann und Dorothea, which depicts this event. My father's mother's family, the Fechheimers, they came from northern Bavaria in various little towns around the town of Mitwitz, and they were mostly in the business of dyeing cloth and probably trading in textiles. My father's ancestors came from Harburg, which is just a little bit north of the Danube in Germany. And both families, the Fechheimers and the Wassermans, were known since about 1600 in those places. The Wasserman people apparently were mostly in trading cattle, and one of the Wassermans was appointed Salzfaktor, to the ruling person there. His job then was to bring salt from the Salzburg area to the Harburg area, and he carried this on for most of his life, and then his son did too. As you know, people were confined to these little, Jews were confined to these little villages for centuries. And finally in 1850 or thereabouts, the Jews became free to go elsewhere. And my great-grandfather Elkan at that time came to Munich, and he bought a candle factory. And this factory, which then added soap and other products, over the years remained in the family and existed until after World War II, until about 46 or so. My father was the older of two boys in the family. He, of course, should have been the follower in taking care of the factory, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to go into medicine, so he studied medicine in Munich and went into medical research and continued to do that for the rest of his life, except for a brief intermission when he was a medical surgeon in World War I. My mother, now we should have a couple of pictures up at that point, huh?
Got 'em.
How's that?
Is something up there? Well, yeah. Could you go back one? Yeah, there on your left is my mother, in the middle my father, and the other one is my sister, when she was about 18 or so at that time. So my mother, as I said, was raised in Stuttgart, and she also went into medicine, and as was common in those days, she did her studies in various universities, in Strasbourg, in Kiel, in Heidelberg, and in München. My mother took very good care of us, and as a doctor also looked after our health very well. And she had a much better humanistic education than we did as children, and was able to help us with our homework quite a lot. I, as a boy, stuck very close to my mother, would often go with her on errand shopping, or when she made house calls, or when she visited somebody. So we were very close. My father had a lot of humor. He was always playing, and he was sort of an actor, and he wrote many skits as a young man. And he played with us. He got down on the floor, played with trains with us and so forth, told us stories, And there were particularly two characters that he would tell us about when we were in bed in the evening, and their adventures always foreshadowed what we were going to go through as children. He had a couple of books about World War I with lots of pictures in them, and he'd sit down with us and we'd look at those pictures and he'd tell us stories about his adventures in World War I. So from his side of the family, World War I was very much on our minds as we were growing up. My sister and I, we were very close. Did, of course, everything together. We even dressed the same sometimes. But she was much more on her own as a youngster than I was. I was much more closely attached to my parents. So then, as my own childhood, when I was 4 years old, a maid came into our house, Maria, and she stayed with us, with the family, for about 10 years. But she did the day-to-day taking care of us while we were children. As we got a little older, we had our vacations with my grandparents in Stuttgart. These were spring vacations and summer vacations. My uncle Walter had been killed very early in World War I, and my grandparents, and then we with them, would go to his grave every Sunday. So from that side too, World War I was very much in our minds. When we got a little bigger, we got to go on ski vacations, and when I was about 10 years old, we got a little car, and then we'd go to the countryside on Saturdays or Sunday afternoons and walk, swim, have coffee and cake and so forth. I started gymnasium when I was 9 years old, and gymnasium lasted 8 years. And I had the same classmates all the way through because it was an all-boys school. And so we were all good friends. And in the Hitler time, there was no distinction made between me as a half-Jew and the other people. We all played together, had fun together. During the Hitler time then, of course, all the boys and all the girls went into the Hitler Youth. I, of course, was not eligible for that, and I joined a Protestant youth organization which functioned just like the Boy Scouts do every place. We had a little place in the country where we would go weekends and play, and we went on many bicycle trips lasting several days at a time in various parts of Bavaria. later on, of course, I had a bicycle, and that was my transportation, and I roamed all around town and the countryside. I had friends who were interested in music, and we went to a lot of concerts together. I was allowed to go to Italy on my own when I was about 15 for about a week. Spent there in Florence and in several other towns in the Tuscany area. So, I had a good time as a youngster. Now, on the other side of that, of course, in 1933, Hitler was appointed Reichskanzler, and when I came home with those news, my mother wept. She knew what was going to happen. A month later or two, they burned down the Reichstag building, the parliament building, and the parliament was dissolved, and Hitler became a dictator. Meanwhile, already those who were dissidents and opponents to the regime were sent to Dachau, and many of them never returned. There were, of course, placards and all kinds of propaganda all over the place about the terrible things the Jews had done and the homosexuals and whatnot. But a year after Hitler came to power, there was the Röhm Putsch. Some of his closest associates had gotten together and were going to overthrow Hitler's regime, but their plot was discovered and they were shot, all of them, the next morning. So we were in the midst of a very ruthless regime. We knew all that, and in spite of that we carried on as best we could. In 1935, my father had to retire from his position at the university, was no longer allowed to teach, and pretty soon lost all his laboratory space. And then about 1937, he just had nothing to do anymore. It was a very miserable time for him. He sent letters all over the world trying to get a job somewhere else. Didn't work. So he finally made a tour to the southeastern part of Canada and the eastern part of the United States, visited all his colleagues in these various universities, finally got a job at the University of Chicago. And he went there in December of 1937. I was allowed to finish gymnasium, and I joined him then half a year later. I came to this country in May of 1938. Now, my father's brother Paul, his younger brother, of course, he had taken over the factory, and he had a PhD in chemistry. And he, of course, tried to get out of the country as well, but he did not succeed, despite efforts by my father and others. So he also had to give up his position in the factory as its director. And then came Kristallnacht, which would have been late in 38. And all the Jews were rounded up, all the men, and one of our friends spirited my uncle out of the city to the country place of some of our relatives, and there he stayed in hiding for about 2 weeks under a carport, a dugout under the carport. And then things blew over. He got back to negotiating the transfer of the factory, and they even built a laboratory for him. But then the time came when he was ordered to load freight cars at one of the railroad stations in Munich. And eventually, when he apparently became too weak to do that, then he was put on a railroad car and shipped to Riga, where he perished. My grandmother and my aunt spent the entire 4 years of the war in Theresienstadt, a concentration camp. But they survived it, and actually, according to her diary, my aunt had a pretty good time. She was herself a very sociable person. And of course there were a lot of highly educated people, lots of musicians and artists and so on, and they had a good time entertaining themselves and each other. So then that much for my childhood and youth. So I came to the United States in May of 1938, after I had finished my Abitur in Germany. You know, at that time we were still thinking that this whole thing was going to blow over, so there was no great hurry to leave. Anyway, I came to the United States half a year after my father. We lived together in a residence hotel. For that time, money was very short, but we tried very hard to learn English and to accommodate ourselves in every way. We went to the movies twice a week in order to learn our English better. About 2 weeks after I came to Chicago, I started a course in zoology, and that was pretty difficult still at the time, having to read the instructions and having to write little essays about what we had seen in our microscopes and so on. Then let's have a drink here. one of my grandmother's cousins, Edwin Fetcher, was in Chicago, and he took up connections with my father long before I came, and we became really a part of that family. We would go to the home in Winnetka every other weekend, and then after I finished my zoology course, I was allowed to go to their summer place in northern Michigan, and there, particularly cousin Margaret, Edwin's wife, was very helpful. In teaching me English, we read The Tale of Two Cities together, and of course some of the children sometimes came for a little while to stay, and all of them were very helpful in correcting my English and encouraging me to speak up and so forth. We made music together there. I played the violin, Margaret played the piano, and of course we had a lot of fun just around the place, working, fixing roads, fixing the pier and stuff like that. Margaret was the daughter of John Root. John Root was one of the architects who helped rebuild Chicago after World War, after the big fire, which was, what 1880. So she was well connected in Chicago society. She showed me around town, and we visited some of her relatives and friends in their marvelous estates out in the country, and she took me to concerts and so on. So everybody helped very much in our adjustment to this country. Now, during this time, beginning when my father had come to this country, to the time when my mother finally was able to come, which was about 16 months later, letters went back and forth between Chicago and Munich. All this time, each of us wrote a letter at least once a day, long letters, which of course to a large extent had to do with our worries about the impending war and all the difficulties that my mother had in trying to get her passport back. When my father left, they had confiscated her passport, and it was not at all clear why, and it became obvious only at the very end that they really wanted my father back in Germany. You know, as a professor at the university, he was a state employee, and he had been given a 2 years leave, so the bureaucracy wanted him back, even though had he come back he would have had the same fate as his brother. So then I, of course, continued through college and medical school, and at that time also went to many concerts and had girlfriends. There was particularly one girl, Helen, in the first year that I was there, to whom I became very close, and we studied together, and she was sort of like a mother figure to me at that time when my mother was 4,000 miles away. In January 44, when I was an intern, I met Sarah, who became my wife, and we courted while I was an intern, and then when I was away in the army by letters, and we were married a year later in January 45. So I finally, well, I should mention that in last year of medical school, everybody went into the military service. So I became a private first class, and as soon as I had my uniform and all, they took me down to the courthouse, and I became a citizen. So then, in the latter part of 44, I went on active duty in the army. I had some preliminary training there, and then was shipped overseas to Normandy, and to Camp Lucky Strike. All the army camps at that time were labeled named for cigarette brands. So there we were, configured as a general hospital, but practically all of us were just fresh out of our training, and there was just one specialist, so the hospital was never set up. After some weeks of being there, by that time, late February or March of that year, the armies went across the Rhine and liberated the American soldiers who had been prisoners of war there. And they came back to us to be taken care of and processed. Of course, they had been badly fed, and when they were liberated, of course, were overfed, and they all had intestinal problems, and they mostly came on open trucks, standing up, going over dirt roads, and they all had blepharitis, this inflammations of the eyes because of all the dust that they'd been exposed to. Otherwise, they were okay. So we took care of them for a couple of weeks, perhaps. And then again, I had nothing else to do but censor the mail that the GIs were writing home and doing sick call. And we would wander around the neighborhood to nearby towns and so on. And then I got orders to 3rd Army headquarters, which at the time was in Trier, which is a little town the west side of the Rhine River. And so I hitchhiked there by various conveyances. First an infantry unit, and when we split ways, then I was standing by the side of the road with my duffel bag and my trunk, waiting for some other army vehicle to pick me up. Finally got to Trier, but by that time the headquarters of the 3rd Army had moved to Frankfurt. So I hitchhiked on to Frankfurt and spent 2 days there, and there in luxury. They already had white tablecloth and chinaware and silverware and wine and girls serving us and so on. Quite different from our rations before that and our tent accommodations before that. So then an ambulance picked me up and took me to my final post there, which was near Nuremberg. We drove through the night in blackout, and one of the towns that we went through was Schweinfurt, which made ball bearings and had been completely leveled. There was hardly anything left of the town, and our location at that time was supposed to be just this side of Nuremberg, but we overshot. I went through Nuremberg again. There was hardly anything there. Could hardly tell you were in a town. We finally figured it out and went back. At that time, you might put on this slide of Pedro, huh? So there he is. Yeah. Well, I joined a medical company there, and this fellow had made his way from Warsaw to our unit. His parents had perished in ways that I'm not sure of in Warsaw, and he turned out to be a very useful and cheerful companion, because he was just a civilian, but he spoke a little German, and he rounded up some women, slaughtered some chickens for us, and made some chicken dishes and so on. So we were there for a couple of days, and then we went on finally across the Danube into southern Bavaria. There were a few days of still shooting, fighting. We had one serious casualty coming in, and then a little girl who somehow had an accidental gunshot wound, and we labored over her for quite a while, but sent her off in pretty good shape. During our travel further south, which was very rapid by then, you know, the army, the camps, the armored divisions were marching through there very rapidly, but we had an officer's call during that time at which Patton appeared, all spit and polish and with his riding crop, and he talked to us a little bit. And two things that I remember about it is he was talking about exploration by fire. That's what you do with in your tank when you come up against a house or something that might hide the enemy. You just shoot into it, destroy it, and then you go on. And the other thing I remember is he was telling us that the crowds were up Shit Creek without a paddle. And so it wasn't very many days till VE Day, which I think was May the 8th. By that time we had arrived in a little town called Thun, and about 3-4 days later, German soldiers came in surrendering, and a stockade was set up for them. Fortunately, it was right next to the little community hospital there. So to start with, there were only a couple hundred, but pretty soon, of course, lots of them surrendered. As many as 2,000 at a time we had in the camp there. And since I spoke German, I was assigned to take care of the medical end of that camp. So I spent many days and sometimes late evenings there at the camp examining these people. They were all in terrible shape. Many still had open wounds, unhealed fractures and stuff like that. And several were sick enough to need to go to the hospital next door, so we were taking care of them there. So I was very busy with these prisoners, and I went to a number of German supply depots to get provisions for our medical care, and visited the hospital in Simbach, and was shown around there, and learned a bit more about how they were treating patients with typhoid fever and so on. course, there was a great deal of conflict feeling among us soldiers. Here, the war was over as far as Europe was concerned. The Germans were very happy about it. Of course, they all felt Hitler had done a terrible thing to them. And so there were what young men were left, walking around with their girls in nice dresses and so on. And we were still in meager quarters, no luxuries, bad food, and so on. But so it was our job to clean up after all of this. So there's a lot of resentment about that. And should we really bother to take care of these swine, or should we just let them rot? No, obviously my job as a doctor was to take care of them. One little example of the sentiments, where we were quartered in a farmhouse, a German couple, middle-aged, lived there. They had escaped from the bombing in München, and so I was talking with them, and turned out that he claimed to have sublet his apartment to my mother at some time before the war, helping her out. So we were on good terms, and so were the soldiers with him. But then they rummaged around in his apartment and they found a Nazi uniform of recent vintage. So he had been, until some time before that, one of the German officers. So from then on, of course, we threw him out. We had to find a place somewhere else to live. We confiscated his furniture and so on. Then there was the question of fraternizing, because we were not supposed to fraternize, because my job was fraternizing all day long with the German prisoners of war and medical personnel here and there and so forth. And actually, I was caught on the carpet one time for fraternizing. Well, of course, it came to nothing. After we finally got done with the prisoners of war, we again had a lot of free time. And one trip was to Berchtesgaden, to the Eagle Nest, Hitler's alternate command post. And well, there I am looking at some dispatches that I found in Hitler's desk up there. So, of course, that was a glorious moment for me to be here as a victor. So then other times I was able to go to Munich And that's glad that would do for that. That was the center of town in Munich. That was all that was left then. And then another time I went to visit my cousin Yandi, who had worked as a laboratory technician in a little town near Munich. So we had a reunion after maybe 6 years or so. We went to Garmisch at that time as well, because one of my relatives, they had a house there, which it turned out had been taken over by the Forest Service at that time. So anyway, we looked at that, and after that, then another time I visited one of my father's friends, also out in the country. We had a nice afternoon of talking and swimming, and I got some Chinaware, which was a specialty of that little community. Another time, then I went to visit a family in Croton-Mühl, and there comes probably the last slide, no, further up. Where a second cousin of mine joined us. She is the one you were left in front. She was at the time working as interpreter with the American interim government. So we had a good time there. Some of the other people in that picture are this Irmingard's mother, and one of my colleagues in the army, and the driver that brought us, and so forth. So I also visited a woman who had been my father's assistant in his laboratory. And I had hoped to go to Theresienstadt to see my grandmother and my aunt, but they wouldn't let me, because Theresienstadt was in the Russian Russian territory, and they were afraid that there might be an incident with me trying to go over there. Now, as I've said before, they finally were liberated from the concentration camp and continued their life in Munich. Eventually, I returned to the United States. The unit that I was with, the 13th Armored Division, was a California division. They had trained in California, so that's where we ended up again. And it also happened that my wife's family had been in Los Angeles ever since 1930, and her mother was still living there. So ended up in California, first at Camp Cook, at the hospital, the Army hospital there. And at that time, German prisoners of war who were stationed in the Central Valley and doing agricultural work there, and they came over for their medical care to us, so there was that connection still to the war. And then finally I was assigned to Camp McQuaid, a disciplinary barracks, where American prisoners were sent, people who had been court-martialed, mostly for very minor offenses, like hitting a corporal or a sergeant, or stealing a government radio or something like that. So they were sentenced to 10 years at hard labor, and we had this elaborate setup of examining each of them psychiatrically, long histories, and several psychological tests. And what it all came to then is that they went before the clemency board and they were all sent home. So that, I think, is the end of my story.
Not quite a month.
We did it in an hour.
Did you want to answer some questions?
Sure, if there are questions, comments.
Does anyone have a question? I have the microphone. I'll bring it to you.
I have a question. What did you do? What happened to your sister?
Oh, good question. My sister was much more a free spirit than I was. You know, I did not rebel at all. I realized how serious the situation was. My sister did not. And she had a lot of good friends, mostly around the hockey club that she belonged to. And well, actually in the Hitler time, the hockey club was going to meet in, I think it was in Bad Kreuznach. But anyway, and the authorities wouldn't let my daughter, I mean my sister, go with them because she was half Jewish. And the athletes rebelled, and she was finally allowed to go with them. But anyway, she ended up in Lausanne to study French better. She had had quite a bit of French in school, and she finally went to Paris, and finally she left with my mother to the United States. She married shortly after she came to this country, I would say within a year or so, and her husband was a physiologist, and he worked with Ansel Keys on rations for the military during the war. And after the war, he and his brother John bought a ranch in Colorado. And then Gertrude, my sister, became a ranch girl. She ended up as a solid citizen in Steamboat Springs, taught school in a private school there, taught German and French and Latin, and was very active in the music scene there. So that's about her.
Does anyone else have any questions?
You mentioned that in the middle 30s, people thought, or at least hoped, that the possibility of war would blow over. But at the same time, there must have been a lot of knowledge of both persecution of people and of the other things that the government was doing. As a teenager, how did you react to that? I can imagine teenagers to some extent ignoring it and saying, I'll just go on and live my life, but at the same time it must have been very frightening.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, of course, the whole scene was in front of us all the time. The things that I mentioned, and of course we knew about the concentration camps by that time, and the Jews desperately trying to get out of Germany and all that. So while on the surface my life was very happy, my physiology did not respond that way. We had assemblies in school celebrating the various great events that the Nazis had accomplished. These were frequent meetings, and we were there it was actually the gymnasium at our school. We were all standing up, and at one of the early events of that sort, I fainted, and on subsequent occasions, every time I would get nauseated, get sick to my stomach, and would have to leave. And finally, the teachers caught on and just let me stay outside when those meetings glorifying the Nazis were going on.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Thank you,
Alan?
I wondered what obstacles your mother had in getting the education and so on to become a doctor, being a woman.
I didn't understand that very clearly, but
Did your mother encounter obstacles in becoming a doctor?
no, no, she did not. And quite a few women were becoming doctors already at that time. That's before World War II.
Thank you. Postscript, how did you come to Seattle?
My daughter, Margie, had come to Seattle around 1970, and she went through medical school. Well, first was a nurse and finally became a doctor. Anyway, she was here all this time, and we of course had visited her and the children many times before, and then when my wife started having problems with Alzheimer's, it's time for us to find more sheltered living. So Margie found this place, the Hearthstone, for us, and so that's where we moved.
Anyone have any other questions? Okay, let's give Franz a big round of applause. Thank you so much for your story.